Coming at you from Bellingham, Washington, this is Two Nuts in the Sack. I'm Julie.
And I'm Gavin. The natural world moves in cycles. The sun rises and sets, then rises again. Rivers flow to the sea, evaporate into the air, fall back to the earth, feeding the rivers that flow back to the seas. Plants grow from a seed to a flower, pollinate, make more seeds, and more plants grow. A constant cycle of birth, life, death, and rebirth. It stands to reason that the ancient observers of the human condition, the seemingly linear progression of human life, birth, life, death, did not seem enough. Many religions, philosophies, and movements hold the human soul as a marvel. It makes us who we are. It is natural as the world it inhabits. A gift like that would be a shame if it were just a flash in the pan. Tonight, we're going to take a look at the cyclic life. Transmigration, metempsychosis, all terms for the broad concept of reincarnation, the rebirth of the aspect of an individual that persists after corporeal death, consciousness, mind, the soul, or some other entity repeated in one or more successive existences. So sit back, relax, as we look at the subject, possibly not for the first time, reincarnation.
Reincarnation is a philosophical or religious belief that the non-physical essence of a living being starts a new life in a different physical form or body after biological death. It is also called birth of transmigration. Reincarnation is a certain tenet of Indian religions, namely Jainism, Buddhism, Sikhism, and Hinduism. It is an esoteric belief in many streams of Orthodox Judaism and is found in different forms. In some beliefs of North America, natives and some indigenous Australians believe in rebirth. Metempsychosis was held by Greek historic figures, such as... Why don't you read that word, Gavin?
Pythagoras.
Thank you. Socrates and Plato. It is also a belief in various modern religions. The mainstream historical and contemporary followers of Cathars, Alawites, the Druze, and the... Gavin?
Rosicrucians.
Thank you. The historical relations between these sects and the beliefs about reincarnation that were characteristic of... Here you go, Gavin. It's a word for you again.
Neoplatonism.
Orphism.
Hermeticism. Manichaeanism.
And ghostism?
Gnosticism.
I like ghostism better. I'm not sure what that would mean, but it sounds cool. Anyways, of the Roman era, as well as the Indian religions, have been the subject of recent decades. And many Europeans and North Americans have developed an interest in reincarnation, and many contemporary works mention it.
At the University of Virginia, there's a department devoted to the study of the paranormal and the mind. Amongst their studies are near-death experiences, the study of those who have experienced physical death but returned from death's doorstep. Neuroimaging, the study of the psi, which studies individuals who experience anomalous interaction between humans and their environments, ESP, telekinesis, and the like. They also study altered states of consciousness, pretty self-explanatory, but more poignant to our subject, though, is the studies of children who report memories of previous lives. Within this division, the main focus is the study and documentation of evidence of reincarnation. There are some young children, mostly aged 2 to 5, who seem to show behaviors like phobias or preferences that are strange when examining their family lives or events.
That just fascinates me. It's all these young kids that are getting the reincarnation experiences. That just blows my mind. I'm like, these kids must be they have to be super intelligent kids. like just well-rounded. You know what I mean?
Well, yes and no. But in many cases, the child's statements have been shown to correspond to the facts in the life and death of real deceased persons. In some cases, the children have birthmarks or defects that correspond to wounds or other marks that existed on their previous incarnation. These cases have been confirmed in post-mortem reports of the deceased. In most cases, the child's remembrance of past lives fade around the age of 7, and most go on to live a normal life. Since its founding in 1967 by Dr. Ian Stevenson, he believed that an intellectual revolution was needed. The current mindset of mainstream science and philosophy in the West portray mind, personality, and consciousness as nothing more but byproducts of brain activity and cease to exist at the moment the brain dies. The Division of Perceptual Studies have taken it upon themselves to challenge these beliefs by rigorously evaluating empirical evidence suggesting that consciousness can survive death. The mind and brain are both distinct and separable. After more than 50 years, this shift from the prevailing physicalist picture, though most of the scientific community remains skeptical as evidence amasses from the Division of Perceptual Studies, a growing number of scientists and philosophers are becoming convinced that science needs to expand in directions that allow accommodations for genuine spiritual experiences without the loss of scientific integrity. It is possible that scientific assumptions and theories about the nature of the relationship between mind, consciousness, and the body may be incomplete. Dr. Stevenson believed that there was a way to objectively and scientifically investigate occurrences of extrasensory perception, apparitions and deathbed visions, poltergeist activities, near-death experiences, as well as the claimed memories of past lives.
Now wait, explain the poltergeist activity. I'm curious.
That's part of the ESP. They believe that it's tied to extrasensory perception and or telekinesis of children, mostly adolescent children.
That is fascinating.
So reincarnation was the main focus of Dr. Stevenson's research. Though he had a passion and enthusiasm for his research, he was careful not to lose objectivity. He was methodical in his investigation. When conducting interviews, he would consider the following. The persons interviewed. The preference was a first-hand informant, the closest kin to the deceased, or the reincarnate, and their closest kin, with first-hand observation of the phenomena. He then would consider the qualifications of the persons interviewed, looking into their backgrounds, determining levels of education, closest of kinship to either decedent or reincarnate, as well as assessing mental health and stability of those he interviewed. Conduct of the interview was of the utmost importance. After allowing subjects and informants to tell their stories from beginning to end, the interviewer would take the reins of the conversation, and a schedule of questions would be asked to objectively guide the interviewer through the narrative of the interviewee, in order to extract all relative and relevant details to further the investigation.
You know what goes through my head? It's like, is it the same soul or is it two different souls like that are inhabiting one person? Like, what is it?
Basically, he comes down to it, and I'll get to this later, but he comes down to it is one soul. But there are other times when it could be two souls inhabiting one body. But we'll get there.
Right, and you'd mentioned like possession too as well.
Yes, like I said, we'll get
You'll get there. Sorry, I'm jumping the gun as usual, Gavin. I apologize.
Tape recorders were used, but mainly for reference. The main recording tool of investigators was handwritten notes, in which researchers are able to take notes not just on the conversation, which was often mediated by an interpreter in their non-English speaking countries, but also taking notes on mannerisms and body language of the interviewee. As better technology caught up to these type of investigations, printed or written documents became increasingly more valuable to the research process. strengthening the cases for the correlation between the birthmarks and defects of the reincarnate with the deceased. A little black and white to help better define the gray areas of this type of investigation. Psychological tests and special questionnaires are newer to the investigation process, but have become important for verification and remaining objective within the investigation, and allows for a litmus across all cultures and individuals examined and interviewed. The data collection process is usually performed over a region, especially in Asian countries where there's a greater belief in reincarnation. So with plenty of cases reported and documented comes the rigorous process of analysis. The same objectivity is employed, taking into consideration regional results and doing cross-cultural analyses. The analysis of the data followed a protocol like data collection. To begin, researchers would consider all alternative interpretations of the individual cases, focusing on elements that can validate or invalidate a subject's authenticity. The circumstances of the death, the now reborn person, whether or not those interviewed had first-hand knowledge of the evidence presented and collected. For example, was it a family story that spread through a community, possibly corrupting the supposed incarnate's story? Are records available to verify details given by the incarnate about their previous life, memories, or death? After review of individual cases, the analysis expands to groups of cases in search of recurrent features cross-culturally, first examining the universal features, the words and phrasing and circumstances that appeared in cases of all cultures, and other features that are culture-bound or varied from one culture to another. For example, men who remember their past life as a woman, and vice versa, something that can be culturally taboo.
Do you think that's something that confuses people, like, currently?
Possibly, but most gender dysphoria comes later in life.
Right.
Though through the analysis interpretations are made and examined focusing in 5 normal skeptical interpretations. Fraudulent claims, which were found but rarely because the people interviewed for the most part had neither the time nor resources or motivation to perpetuate a fraudulent claim. Could also be interpreted as fantasy, where the alleged incarnate only believes in their past life without evidence beyond their own belief, which is why the University of Virginia researchers developed the practice of psychological testing and standardized questionnaires. There's cryptomnesia, another interpretation meaning that the incarnate has somehow normally learned the information they express as memory, but claim not to know where the information came from. So they remember a story that they heard and they just insert themselves into that story as their own memory.
Oh, wow.
There's also paramnesia, where informants have modeled their memories and are given more credit than the incarnate is actually due. So basically, people are like, oh yeah, he's totally a reincarnate of this guy. I saw him do this and this and this. And then that just becomes the narrative of that person's life. So then they believe it themselves because they've been reinforced by everybody telling them the same story over and over again.
So when they start living it.
Right. This is the interpretation that most skeptics glom onto, as it is an easy way to explain. The incarnate doesn't really remember those details. It was reinforcement and embellishment from the informers that makes the case more believable. As research continues into modern times, the last interpretation of the analysis is genetic memory, supported by the fact that successive generations of rats either running mazes or positive and negative reinforcement exercises appear to get faster running the maze or wiser when it comes to positive and negative reinforcement. Basically, a rat runs a maze, then that rat's successive generations know how to run that maze through genetic memory.
That's fascinating.
So Dr. Stevenson humored this last analysis interpretation for completion because of evidence behind it, but didn't consider it really relevant to his case studies that he was trying to present. Though in some cases, mannerisms of the deceased presented in the reincarnates. So they did actually remember how to do things that their past reincarnate or that their past life person did. Eliminating these interpretations leads to further analysis but widens the scope to interpretations that consider paranormal processes and some of the other studies of the division of perceptual studies, like extrasensory perception, combined with the development of a secondary personality, in which the deceased is the secondary personality, channeled through the incarnate via ESP. Another possible interpretation is possession, wherein the disincarnate person, a soul or spirit, imposes its memories on the incarnate. Both interesting interpretations, not to be discredited or discarded lightly, as the University of Virginia team has encountered both types of cases. But we won't get into that on this podcast.
Which is kind of a bummer. I would love to hear about it.
Last on the list of analytic interpretations is an actual case of reincarnation. So long as all other interpretations have been proven false, if a case reaches this point of verification, from here another protocol is set in place to further vet the case before it can be considered strong evidence. First, the testimony of the incarnate correctly corresponds to events in the deceased, but only one deceased person, so as to eliminate confusion. Second, the families of either the incarnate or the deceased had no previous knowledge to help dispel claims of cryptomnesia and paramnesia. Third, statements from all parties involved, but especially the incarnate, are recorded and documented before the verification process begins, eliminating or alleviating bias or prejudice, and ideally, the case must be investigated within a few weeks or months of the development of the case. These directives drove Dr. Stevenson to focus his research to children from ages 2 to 7 because of their limited experience on this planet, where memories of a past life to present itself, this type of clean slate would be ideal for discovery, as well as limit outside influence to the incarnate's story. This is a part of the universal features across cultures I talked about earlier. Throughout all of his studies, there were common factors in the investigations. Almost all began speaking of their previous life between ages 2 and 5, using statements like, "When I was big, before I was born, before I died, I used to live in a different house." Spontaneous reference to past life experiences usually taper off between ages 5 and 7, but many continue to remember their past life long after. Dr. Stevenson also noted as a universal feature in about 60% of cases, the previous life ended in a very violent way, and a high frequency of the child mentioning the mode of death that ended their previous life. There have been many cases of reincarnation studied by Stevenson and his colleagues. Unfortunately, Stevenson passed away in 2007, but his mantle was picked up by Dr. Jim B. Tucker, who continued the exploration of, as Dr. Stevenson so eloquently phrased it, studies of cases of the reincarnation type. One such case was that of James Leininger. Though not the primary source for the research, Dr. Jim Tucker did review and report on this case of the reincarnation type in Explore, a scientific journal. I'll do my best to sum it up. It is a remarkable tale, but a longer article wherein Dr. Tucker runs the story through the aforementioned ringer. But first, let's hear about the theological side, because it is, after all, the base of the ideology of reincarnation. Take it away, Julie.
Okay, well, we'll get started on the religion, but Gavin, please bear with me because These words are tough and hard to pronounce.
I will do my best to assist you.
According to various Buddhist scriptures, Gautama Buddha believed in the existence of an afterlife in another world and in reincarnation. In the Buddha Majjhima, translated by Peter Harvey, the Buddha also asserted that karma influences rebirth, and that the cycles of repeated births and deaths are endless. Before the birth of Buddha, ancient Indian scholars had developed competing theories of afterlife, including the materialistic school, such as Charvaka, which posited that death is the end. There is no afterlife, no soul, no rebirth, no karma. And they describe death to be a state where a living being is completely annihilated. Buddha rejected this theory, adopted the alternate existing theories on rebirth, criticizing the materialistic schools that denied rebirth and karma. The Buddha introduced the concept that there is no permanent self, meaning soul, and this central concept in Buddhism is called anatta. Major contemporary Buddhist traditions such as Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana traditions accept the teachings of Buddha. These teachings assert there is rebirth, there is no permanent self, and no irreducible Atman. Atman? Atman, meaning soul, moving from life to another, and trying these lives together. There is no impermanent that all compounded things, such as living beings, are aggregates, dissolve at death, but every being reincarnates. The rebirth cycle continues endlessly, states Buddhism, and it is a source of dukkha, suffering, pain. But this reincarnation dukkha cycle can be stopped through nirvana, not the band. The anatta doctrine of Buddhism is a contrast to Hinduism. Soul exists, it is involved in rebirth, and it is through the soul that everything is connected. In the major Christian denominations, the concept of reincarnation is absent and is nowhere explicitly referred to in the Bible. However, the impossibility of a second earthly death is stated by Peter 3:18-20, where it affirms that Jesus Christ, God, died once forever for the sins of all humankind. In Matthew 14:1-2, King Herod Antipas identified Jesus Christ, God, with a risen John the Baptist before ordering his necking execution. In a survey by the Pew Forum in 2009, 24% of American Christians expressed a belief in reincarnation, and in a 1981 survey, 31% of regular church-going European Catholics expressed belief in reincarnation. Some Christian theologians interpret certain biblical passages as referring to reincarnation. These passages include the questioning of Jesus as to whether he is Elijah, John the Baptist, Jeremiah, or another prophet. Matthew 16:13-15 and John 1:21-22. And less clearly, while Elijah was said...
Less clearly than that?
Less clearly, yeah, I know, right? Like, wow, it's like a Bible passage. Like, come on. Less clearly, while Elijah was said not to have died, but to have been taken up to heaven. John the Baptist being asked if he is not Elijah, John 1:25. McGregor, an Episcopalian, oh my God.
Good job, baby.
Just say it right, like I had a bit of an accent with that, Kevin.
Episcopalian.
McGregor, an Episcopalian.
If it helps.
I can say it with an accent.
Alright, keep going.
Priest and professor of philosophy has made a case for the compatibility of Christian doctrine and reincarnation. There is evidence that a church father in early Christian times taught reincarnation in his lifetime, but that when his works were translated into Latin, these references were concealed. One of the epistles written by St. Jeremy to Avitus, which asserts the origins on first principles, was mistranscribed. Origins of first principles was mistranscribed. Reincarnation in the Druze faith is an eternal duality of the body and the soul, and it is impossible for the soul to exist without the body. While in the Hindu and Buddhist belief system, a soul can be transmitted to any living creature. In the Druze belief system, this is not possible, and a human soul will only transfer to a human body. Souls cannot be divided into different or separate parts, and the number of souls existing is finite. Few druses are able to... I
don't think it's druses. I think it's
What is it?
It's druze. It's kind of like deer or fish.
How do you say it?
Few druze.
Druze. So that's what I was saying.
Yeah, but it's not druzes.
But there's an S on the end.
Yeah, there's something wrong with that. It's like fish or deer.
Yeah, but in the title, there's no S, but this means multiples. There's multiple druzes.
Okay, that would be like saying, look at all the deers over there. Or look at all the fishes in the sea.
Okay, few druz are able to recall their past, but if they are able to, they are called a natek. Souls who have died violent deaths in their previous incarnation will be able to recall memories. That just fascinates me. It's like, wow, if you have a really shitty death, you're going to remember your next life, Gavin.
Yeah. It makes enough sense, though, really. It's like, I was taken out really, really badly, and even the Almighty was like, reset button on that one. That was hard to watch.
It's like, they can't send me to hell. I lived it on Earth. What? Does that not make sense?
It kind of makes sense because their other beliefs is that we live in hell and we can only reach heaven by being better people. Otherwise, we just stay here. So here is hell because there is no hell. But if there's the heaven and there's something opposite, and that's us, then we live in hell.
I don't believe that. I believe you can actually walk heaven on earth. And that is in the Bible, in fact, that you can actually achieve walking heaven on earth.
It was somewhat a convincing argument until this year.
Perhaps. Heaven is the ultimate happiness received when soul escapes the cycle of rebirth and reunites with their Creator, while hell is conceptualized as the bitterness of being unable to reunite with Creator and escape from the cycle of rebirth. In Hinduism, they believe the body dies, but not the soul, which they assume to be the eternal reality. They believe everything is connected and cyclical. They believe all living beings are composed of two things, the soul and the body. Current karma impacts the future in this, life as well as the future forms and the realms of lives. Good intent and actions lead to a good future.
That stands to reason. I mean, like, if you're a good person on this plane of existence, then you can be a better person in the next.
Basically. Bad intent and actions lead to a bad future, impacting how one reincarnates in the Hindu view of existence.
Do you think Trump will just come back as like a poop log? I mean, like sometimes...
I think he's going to come back as a fly and live on a pile of dog shit.
Fair enough.
There is no permanent heaven. Shit. This is a serious topic. There is no permanent heaven or hell in most Hinduism sects. In the
after arms in Hinduism sects.
Oh my God, Yavin. Only you. In the afterlife, based on one's karma, the soul is reborn as another being in heaven, hell, or a living being on earth. Gods too die once their past karmic merit runs out, as do those in hell, and they return getting another chance on earth. Now, I think this is the first time I've heard about gods dying. That just kind of fascinated me when I was reading that.
Well, it stands to the karmic belief because the gods are, there's basically, you can be such a good person for such a long time that you achieve like a godlike status.
Right.
But if you don't continue to be good and you don't continue to keep doing stuff that is considered good karma, then your built up good karma shrinks back down. It's like your bank account. It's like, oh, I won $1 million. And then you spend all the $1 million and you're an asshole again.
Well, it's like they're saying with the gods that even the gods can be evil and do bad things.
Right. That's what I'm saying.
Well, no, I know it's what you're saying, but anyway, I grew up being raised a Christian, and with Christianity, there's one God, and that's it. So with this, there's like saying is there's like multiple gods. in their religion.
Right, it's called polytheism. Think of the Greeks. Think of
Right.
many Native American religions. There's a whole host of gods because they were like, one person can't do all this shit. There's got to be like a dude that takes care of the woods. There's got to be a dude that takes care of the sun. There's got to be a dude that takes care of pooping.
That's what angels are for, Gavin.
I mean, in Catholics, at least they were like, oh, patron saints.
Right.
Pray to the patron saint. Because God doesn't have time for you being like, I can't drop a dumper right now. Pray to the patron saint of pooping so that I can poop.
Well, being raised a Christian...
Sorry to make it so scatological.
Okay, no, I get it. I have leaned more towards what Catholics believe in because it makes sense. It just makes sense to me.
I don't think you have a full grasp of what the Catholics believe in.
Do we really need to get into that topic?
No, we're getting so far
We're doing
off.
Reincarnation, bitch.
We're in the middle of a different topic. We're getting so far off topic.
This reincarnation continues endlessly in cycles until one embarks on a spiritual pursuit, realizes self-knowledge, and thereby gains moksha. And thereby gains moksha, the final release out of the reincarnation cycle. The
Bhagavad Gita.
The Bhagavad Gita states just as in the body, childhood, adulthood, and old age happen to an embodied being, so also he requires another body. The wise one is not deluded about this. Most Islamic schools of thought reject any idea of reincarnation of human beings or God. They believe a human being only has one life, and upon death, he or she is judged by God, then rewarded in heaven or punished in hell. However, some Muslim minority sects, such as those found among Sufis, and some Muslims in South Asia and Indonesia, have retained their pre-Islamic Hindu and Buddhist beliefs in reincarnation.
They're like, wait a second, so I've been believing in reincarnation the whole time, and then you guys come in and invade our village and tell us that reincarnation isn't a thing? Well, I guess it's not a thing, but we're still gonna kind of believe it out on the side.
Gulat sects the idea of reincarnation and is accepted by a few Shia Muslim sects, particularly of the Gulat Alawis belonging to the Shia denomination of Islam, hold that they were originally stars or divine light that were cast out of heaven through disobedience and must undergo repeated returning to heaven.
So that supports like original sin. Like we were bad in the beginning, and so we have to do better in order to be able to return to the stars.
That particular section is like different from any of the other religions. Like there's none other religion that follows that section I just read.
Well, yeah, but
I'm just making a statement of that. I noticed that.
Okay, as far as Islamic faiths go.
Yeah, as long, yeah. Just within all the religions, so I just noticed that part was just a little slightly different from the others.
So there is some form of compromise in religion.
But somehow in these, they all sort of seem to kind of come together.
Right, it's called compromise.
Yeah, they all kind of seem to come together, just slightly different.
It's called compromise.
Like, compromise. Okay, good. Nice job. Jainism believes that the worldly life is characterized by continuous rebirths and suffering in various realms of existence. Karma forms a big part of Jain faith. The doctrine of karma is not considered in relation to one lifetime, but also in relation to both future incarnations and past lives. The jiva or the soul is born in the world of gods or sometimes hell. Sometimes it acquires the body of a demon. The jiva takes birth as a worm or insect or ant. Karma is the root of birth and death. I really hope I don't come back as a bug.
Well, it sounds like you start as a bug, and then you become a human. Or if you can't become a human, then you become a demon.
Do you think if you're a bug and you have good karma, and you're like good to other bugs, you become human?
Yeah, so then like squash the bugs.
The souls bound by karma go round and round in the cycle of existence. The Jain text states there are 4 gates: demigods, humans, hell beings, and animals, plants, and microorganisms. The demigods occupy the higher levels where the heavens are situated. Humans, plants, and animals occupy the middle levels, and hellish beings occupy the lower levels where 7 hells are situated. Within Judaism, Jewish mystical texts specifically discuss reincarnation. In Lurianic Kabbalah, reincarnation is not retributive or fatalistic, but an expression of divine compassion, the microcosm of the doctrine of cosmic re-edification of creation, is a heavenly agreement with the individual soul. The true essence of anything is the divine spark within that gives it existence. Even a stone or leaf possesses such a soul that came into this world to receive a recertification. A human soul may occasionally be exiled into lower inanimate vegetative or animal creations. The most basic component of the soul must leave at the end of the blood production. There are 4 other soul components in different nations of the world, possesses different forms of souls with different purposes. Each Jewish soul is reincarnated in order to fulfill each of the 613 Mosaic commandments. Mosaic commandments that elevate a particular spark of holiness associated with each commandment. The Ho-Chuk reincarnation is an intrinsic part of some northern Native American and Inuit traditions. The concept of reincarnation is enshrined in the Inuit language. A shaman talks about his 2 previous lives and how he died and came back again to his 3rd lifetime. He describes his time between lives when he was blessed by Earth, Maker, and all the abiding spirits and given special powers, including healing the sick. The Ho-Chuk shaman is referred to as TC. Here is TC's account of his 2 reincarnations. My ghost, was taken to the place where the sun sets. While at that place, I thought I would come back to earth again. And the old man with whom I was staying said to me, "My son, did you not speak about wanting to go to the earth again?" I had, as a matter of fact, only thought of it, yet he knew what I wanted. Then he said to me, "You can go, but you must ask the chief first." Then I went and told the chief of the village of my desire, and he said to me, "You may go and obtain your revenge upon the people who killed your relatives, and you." Then I was brought down to earth. Then I lived until I died. Then I died of old age. As I was lying in my grave, someone said to me, "Come, let us go away." So then we went toward the setting of the sun. There we came to a village where we met all the dead from the place I came to this earth again for the 3rd time. And here I am. Founded in the 15th century, Sikhism's founder Guru Nanak had a choice between the cyclical reincarnation concept of ancient Indian religions and the linear concept of Islam, and he chose the cyclical concept of time. Sikhism teaches reincarnation theory. The doctrine teaches that the soul exists and is passed from one body to another in endless cycles of samsara until liberation from the death and rebirth cycle. The way out of the reincarnation cycle, asserts Sikhism, is to live an ethical life, devote oneself to God's name. The precepts of Sikhism encourage the bhakti of one Lord for mukti, liberation from the death and rebirth cycle.
So now that we've covered both the scientific and theological aspects of reincarnation, would you like to hear the story of the case study of Dr. Jim B. Tucker?
Absolutely.
So this is the case of James Leiniger, an American case of the reincarnation type. This is a paraphrasing of the case report of Dr. Jim B. Tucker, who is now the head of the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies. James Leiniger is the son of Bruce and Andrea Leiniger, a Protestant couple in Louisiana in the United States. James was born on April 10th, 1998. As related by his parents, the first noticeable incident in the case appeared in February of 2000, when James was 22 months old. His father took him to the Kavanaugh Flight Museum outside of Dallas. They were living in Texas at the time. James was fascinated by the planes, and in particular the World War II exhibit. When they left, after 3 hours, James had some toys, as well as a video called "It's a Kind of Magic," about the Blue Angels. James loved the video. He watched it repeatedly for weeks. The trip and the video started or uncovered his love for airplanes. This passion may have led to some knowledge of planes and flying that James often surprised his parents by voicing. The video, however, was clearly not the source of James's information about World War II, since the Blue Angels group was founded in 1946, after the war ended. Within 2 months of the first trip, James developed a habit of saying, "Airplane crash, on fire," and slamming his toys nose first into the family's coffee table. He repeated this behavior over and over, producing dozens of scratches and dents on the table. James's father traveled a lot. When James and his mother would see him off to the airport, James would say, "Daddy, airplane crash, on fire." This happened repeatedly, despite his father's admonishments. Around this time, James began having nightmares. "Airplane crash, on fire. Little man can't get out." James would shout this over and over while thrashing and kicking his legs up in the air. After a few months of this, he had several conversations with his parents about the dreams. Usually, he was preparing to go to sleep. He indicated that they were memories of events from the past. He said his plane had crashed on fire and that it had been shot by the Japanese. 2 weeks after those statements, James said his plane was a Corsair, which was a fighter plane developed during World War II, and he talked about flying a Corsair several times. On August 27th, 2000, when James was 28 months old, he told his parents he had flown his plane off a boat. When his parents asked him the name of the boat, he said Natoma. After that conversation, his father searched online for the word and eventually discovered a description of the USS Natoma Bay, an escort carrier stationed in the Pacific during World War II. He printed out the information. James's parents asked him a number of times for the name of the little man in his dream. He always responded with "me" or "James." A few weeks after James gave the word Natoma, his parents asked him if he could remember anyone else who was with the little man. James responded with the name Jack Larson. One day, when James was just over 2.5, his father was looking through a book he was planning on giving to his own father for Christmas. The Battle for Iwo Jima, 1945. His father reports that James pointed to a picture showing an aerial view of the base of the island, where Mount Suribachi, a dominant volcano, sits, and said, "That's where my plane was shot down." His father said, "What?" And James responded, "My airplane got shot down there, Daddy." A week after that, James's father talked to a veteran from the Natoma Bay who remembered a pilot named Jack Larson. He said Larson flew off one day and never returned, and so no one knew what happened to him. With the ongoing nightmares, James' parents eventually contacted Carol Bauman, who had written a book about children's past life memories. They had a lengthy correspondence. Following Bauman's advice, James' mother started acknowledging him that the events he was describing had indeed happened to him before, while emphasizing that they were in the past and he was now safe. The nightmares grew less prevalent and less frequent. James' parents said that when he became old enough to draw, he drew hundreds of battle scenes involving planes. He signed them James 3.
So you think he was having nightmares of his own death?
Indeed.
Wow, creepy. Poor kid.
But listen to this. When his parents asked him about this, he said the 3 referred not to his age, but to his being the third James. And he continued to sign his pictures that way, even after he turned 4.
Wow.
James may have thought of himself as the third James because James Houston, the pilot, was James Jr. On June of 2002, James' parents were interviewed by ABC News for a segment that was going to be part of a program called Strange Mysteries. The program was never aired, but since Dr. Tucker was also interviewed for it, ABC sent him a copy of the segment. At the time of the interview, Houston had not been identified. Following the interview, James' father corresponded with an ABC producer about the name of Jack Larson. She had a contact at the Center for Naval History who found a John M. Larson, though it was ultimately determined that this man was not the Jack Larson on the Natoma Bay. The correspondence between James' father and the producer is useful documentation that he was indeed searching at the time for a man with that name. 2 months later, James' father wrote a letter to a veteran who told him that Jack Larson had served on the Natoma Bay. In the letter, he mentions this John M. Larson again, documenting this as part of the search. A month later, James' father attending his first Natoma Bay reunion, he learned that Jack Larson from Natoma Bay had survived the war. Though he was not at the reunion, he was still alive, and James' father soon visited him. He also learned that only one pilot from the ship was lost during the Battle of Iwo Jima, a 20-year-old pilot from Pennsylvania named James M. Houston Jr.
Oh.
After the reunion, James' father turned his focus to Houston, as documented by a posting he made on a website looking for information. He learned that Houston did not actually die on Iwo Jima itself. Instead, as the battle continued after the initial assault, he was one of 8 pilots from the ship who took part in a strike against transport vessels in the harbor on nearby Chichijima, as the Japanese were preparing a buildup of troop replacements and supplies. His plane appears to have crashed exactly as James described. The aircraft action report for the day that Houston's plane was shot indicates a chart of the path that each pilot took. Jack Larson, the one name James 3 gave, is shown as the pilot of the plane next to Houston's, as Houston was the only pilot from the Natoma Bay killed during the Iwo Jima operation. And as his details closely matched James's statements, his parents concluded that he was the man whose life James had recalled. James' parents said he gave other details as well, but no documentation of this exists that was made before Houston was identified. James' mother said she made notes of his statements, but that she either lost them or threw them away after she and her husband wrote the book.
Oh, that's most unfortunate.
Indeed, it sort of throws a wrench in the works.
Oh man, I can't believe that.
Dr. Tucker attempted to verify with the sister of James Houston. She was 91 years old at the time. She was unable to really recall the details of the conversation from some 5 years before. Other than that, James's mother asked whether her father was an alcoholic at the time, which he was. James's parents reported that he gave details about his family life that they confirmed with Houston's sister in a phone conversation. James' parents reported that he had knowledge about World War II planes in general and about life on Natoma Bay that impressed them. His fascination with flying and the ability to give details about Natoma Bay that his parents did not know. Again, there is no documentation of those additional statements that was made before Houston was identified. After having sporadic correspondence with James' parents for several years, Dr. Tucker spent 2 days interviewing the family in their home as James was approaching his 12th birthday. Talking with each parent and with James himself, he tried to investigate the case earlier, but James' parents wanted to wait until their book was published before meeting with him. They were completely forthcoming. Once they did meet, he saw a small bookcase of material that James' father had collected about Natoma Bay and related matters. He shared all the relevant records about Houston and the ship, as well as the chronology and pictures of the family experiences. Both James and his parents gave written permission to use their real names. Dr. Tucker was able to observe and interact with James both formally in an interview and informally during a dinner. He found him to be pleasant and cooperative. Though he had hinted he might still have some memories he could talk about when he was older, he did not report any to Dr. Tucker. His development seems to have proceeded well. At 17, he recently became an Eagle Scout. So now we move into the ringer we had talked about, the gamut of questions that was common to the investigational process of the division of perceptual studies. Because this case involves a boy who displayed behaviors that suggested he was recalling a traumatic crash. In addition, he demonstrated knowledge about events from 50 years before he was born. A number of accurate statements were documented before the previous personality was identified, making him part of a limited number of cases that included such records. So he went through the first step, fraud. Fraud must always be considered and cannot be ruled out decisively. In this case, motivation for a hoax appears unlikely. Though James' parents did eventually write a book about their experience that was published when James was 11 years old, it seems unlikely that this led to the wholesale fraud from the beginning. The uncertain payoff of a book at some point in the future would hardly seem worth a multi-year fraud. A fraud had no other potential benefit and carried a substantial risk of inducing derision from friends and family and even strangers, basically conjuring up the internet trolls of today.
It was a good one.
Beyond that, if James' parents were perpetuating a fraud, they passed up a golden opportunity to present their story to the world during their interview for the ABC News Strange Mysteries program. Instead of telling how their son was remembering the life of pilot James Houston, they only said that he appeared to be recalling a life of a World War II pilot who had not been identified. A subsequent interview with ABC identifying Houston did not come out until nearly 2 years later, and James' parents had no way of knowing that another such opportunity would occur. A number of people other than James' parents had heard him talk about his World War II life by then, including his aunt, who Dr. Tucker also interviewed, and the first ABC News crew. So either they or little James would have had to been party to the hoax. Given these factors, his impression of James and his parents, after spending several hours talking to them, view fraud as an implausible explanation for the case. Along with the question of outright fraud, there is the possibility that the memories that James' parents had of the events in the case were unconsciously influenced by the potential for profit from their book, leading them to recall that James's statements and behaviors were more impressive than they actually were. This is one reason for focusing on the items that were documented before Houston was identified, as James' parents had no ability at that point to steer the details to fit with Houston's death. So paramnesia and cryptomnesia both nixed. So we move on to fantasy. With a fantasy explanation, James's apparent memories of the crash would be the result of his imagination, perhaps triggered by his visit to the Flight Museum. The intensity of behaviors argues against this. Though children can have nightmares after being exposed to a frightening stimulus, it seems unlikely that a flight museum would be designed in such a way as to be intensely traumatic to a child. In addition, James's nightmares were much more than a bad dream or two. By the report of his parents and his aunt, he had nightmares multiple times each week, always involving the same scenario. During the day, he repeatedly made the statement, "Airplane crash on fire," and he displayed what appeared to be post-traumatic play, with his compulsive play of airplane crashes. These types of nightmares and play appear very similar to those that children who have experienced trauma in their lives display. Only James seemed associated with events from the distant past. Such behaviors are common in children who report memories of previous lives. The fantasy explanation would require that James's statements matched Houston's life purely by chance. Observers may have different thresholds for what they will accept coincidence as a reasonable explanation for correlated events. But the specifics presented in this case would seem to undermine that plausibility. For a child to give an unusual name like Natoma for a ship which was indeed in the place he reported seems remarkable enough. When Jack Larson's name and the accurate details of Houston's death are added to it, coincidence appears to be an inadequate explanation. We move through the next step, the knowledge acquired through normal means. Is it possible that James learned about Natoma Bay and James Houston through normal means? He could not have learned from people around him because they knew nothing about either the ship or Houston when he began talking about them. James had made all of the documented statements by the time he was 4 years old. He could not have read about them. Regardless, no published materials about James Houston are known to exist. No television programs focusing on Natoma Bay or James Houston appear to have been made either. There is one slight geographical connection between James and Houston's family. James was born in San Mateo, California, which is approximately 30 miles from San Jose.
That's where my mom lives.
A city of 900,000 people, where Houston's sister lived. James' family lived at the time in Pacifica, another 15 miles away, and his parents know of no contact that they had with her. The family moved to Texas when James was 4 months old, then to Louisiana when he was approaching his second birthday. There is no known association in those places with Houston or his family, and no obvious way that James could have learned about him through normal means. Now we get a little bit more paranormal with the psi-mediated information transfer. If we accept the evidence that James had knowledge about Houston's life that he did not acquire through normal means, The possibility is that he learned about Houston through psi or super psi, but James' parents denied that he showed any other psychic abilities, which would suggest that for a paranormal transfer of information to occur, there would need to be something distinct, either about Houston's memories or about the connection between Houston and James. As noted, there is no evidence to indicate that there is any connection between Houston and James other than their first name. It's proposed that the idea of thought bundles, or thought pool may be emitted when a person dies. Though not a living entity, this pool of information would continue to exist for some time and might get attached to particular objects and situations. It would then get absorbed somehow by a very young child who would develop apparent memories of a past life. Basically, these thought bundles or thought pools are the idea that when life ends in a traumatic way, you project your consciousness, i.e., thought bundle, out into the universe or into an object. Now, James' case involved a traumatic death, which might increase the likelihood of a thought bundle. But if he did absorb Houston's memories, they might have then produced the nightmares and post-traumatic play that introduced the case. Why James would have absorbed a thought bundle from Houston, however, rather than many other who died in World War II is unclear. At this point, the conceptual difficulties noted make such an explanation highly speculative. So he's gone through every step which leads to the possibility of reincarnation. So the documentation in James' case provides evidence that he had a connection with a life from the past. On the face of it, the most obvious explanation for this connection is that he experienced a life as James Houston Jr. before having his current life. The facts in the case indicate that this explanation warrants serious consideration. Numerous cases of children who report memories of previous lives have been studied over the past 50 years.
It's just amazing.
Yeah, the idea that they are created through normal means via social or cultural factors is challenged by cases in the West, particularly ones with good documentation, such as James's case. The nightmare and post-traumatic play that James experienced, which are typical of the behaviors many of these children display, demonstrate how difficult apparent past life memories can be for children to have. An understanding of the link between the apparent memories and the emotional and behavioral issues these children experience may be helpful to families, particularly in situations in which the parents are inclined to dismiss the possibility of a past life connection. Awareness of cases such as James's, ones with documentation of a close agreement between events from the life in the past and the memories of a current child expresses, may lead the parents to be less likely to discount their child's reports and more able to help them through the experience.
Certainly hope so. That was a really amazing story, Gavin. That was really good.
I know, right? And my favorite part is that it walked us through a scientific analysis of a possible past life experience.
Yeah, it was very in-depth. You're right, it covered everything.
I know, and took way too long, but god damn it if it wasn't fascinating.
It was fascinating. It was so good. It was an interesting time, and to be like, to have somebody have died, but to be reborn in a little boy who still has people around that could actually verify some of those facts that he was talking about.
Right, and like the fact that they were able to gather so much data.
Right.
I mean, the parents did it first, and it was backed up by the aunt who also was watching over the child, and he had some of these nightmares, and she had to console him. And the fact that the Jack Larson dude actually existed.
Right. Yeah.
And so this 4-year-old child who lived thousands of miles from this Jack Larson person who was a survivor or a pilot on the Natoma Bay, but he was actually a real person, and he was the one that gave them the name James Houston Jr., and that James insisted on calling himself in all of his artwork in early life as James III, not because of his age, but because he was James the Third. Sorry, that shit blows my mind.
No, I know. It's
roll
just,
your eyes.
I'm not rolling my eyes. I'm tired. It is late. It is 1 a.m. That was a long story. Very good. Like, very good.
We push ourselves for you, folks.
Yes, we do. Yes, we're exhausted. This was like the longest podcast research ever. This was a tough one.
Well, there's so many cases.
There is so much stuff. There are so many rabbit holes to dive into.
Background, like people who studied this scientifically. I mean, like psychical research. Like we even touched on it in Doris Bither, because this was actually something they did at UC Berkeley, was kind of look into this kind of stuff.
Well, there's science, there's supernatural, there's just it is hit like the whole world. It just has.
Every culture, every continent, I should say, because not every culture believes in reincarnation, but at least everywhere on Earth, there is some group of people that believe in reincarnation, and there are people out there who are trying to prove it.
Right. All right, Gavin. I don't have as in-depth of a story as what you had, but I do have a story. Would you like to hear it?
Of course.
Okay, wonderful. Okay. Shanti Devi was born on December 11th, 1926 in a little-known town of Delhi. She did not speak much until she reached the age of 4, but otherwise she was just a normal girl like any other in the town. At the age of 4, the little girl started claiming that the home where she lived was not her real home, and that her parents were not her real parents, and began to claim to remember details of her past life. Discouraged by her parents, she ran away from home at age 6, trying to reach Mathura. Back home, she stated in school that she was married and had a son with her husband. She said that her husband lived in Mathura, 145 kilometers from Delhi, but never uttered his name.
That's insane.
Especially to run away at 6 years old. Oh my God.
Right? And she's like, I know where I need to go. I'm going to go find my family.
Right? Yeah. I mean, geez, scary. That's just a very motivated little girl.
Yeah.
Like, I've got to find out the truth. I need to understand what is happening to me.
It makes you want to put a leash on your own child.
Yeah.
Just in case this should happen.
Interviewed by her teacher and headmaster, she used words from the Mathura dialect and said that her husband was a cloth merchant. Shanti Devi told that not only was she married, but that she died 10 days after childbirth.
Right. So she recalled her past life, but she recalled it in a different dialect than what she was raised to speak.
At 6 years old.
That's nuts.
Yep. That little girl even mentioned 3 distinctive features of her husband. She said that her husband wore reading glasses and a wart on his left cheek and was a fair-skinned man.
That's pretty distinct.
The headmaster located a merchant by that name in Mathura who had lost his wife, Lugdi Devi, 9 years earlier, 10 days after having given birth to a son. Kedar Nath also said in the reply that Pandit Kanjimal, one of his relatives, lived in Delhi and should be allowed to meet Shanti Devi. Pandit Kajimal personally met Shanti Devi and was surprised to find the amount of detail she gave about Kedarnath. Thus, gave about Kedarnath. Thus, Kajimal arranged for Shanti Devi's and Kedarnath's meeting. Kedarnath, his and Lugdi's son, and his present wife. Kedarnath was, however, posed as his elder brother of himself
instead of himself. So basically, he was trying to do his own sort of like trick on this. By he's like, yeah, I'm Kedarnath's brother. He brought their son. So he was trying to be objective about it because he'd heard of this girl that tried to come
he was
find
like
us.
super skeptical. He's like super skeptical. I'm like, you're claiming to be my dead wife? What?
Right.
Shanti Devi recognized him immediately, and also his son Navneet Lal, and even pointed out to her mother the fair color of Kedarnath and the wart on his left cheek. As she knew several details of Kedarnath's life with his wife, he was soon convinced that Shanti Devi was indeed the reincarnation of Lugdi Devi. An investigation was conducted. The case was brought to the attention of Mahatma Gandhi, who set up
wait. Mahatma Gandhi? Like the actual, like, Gandhi?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
That's pretty cool.
He's like, I'm kind of a big deal.
Exactly.
Okay, who set up a commission to investigate a report was published in 1936. The commission traveled with Shanti Devi to Mathura, arriving on the 15th of November, 1935. The commission's report concluded that Shanti Devi was indeed the reincarnation of Lugdi Devi. Shanti also chastised Shab for remarrying, as he had promised Lugdi he would not. Ian Stevenson found the Shanti Devi case to be correct. He worked long and hard to find infallible evidences on this case and came up with some startling facts which established the veracity of Shanti's claims. Shanti wasn't deluding people after all.
In conclusion, human beings are remarkable creatures. We have passion, imagination, great capacity for love. On the other hand, we can be vicious and wicked to one another. This duality is part of what makes us so interesting. At our core, we have something amazing. Our soul, our psyche, our spirit, our life force, whatever you choose to call it. The immaterial part of our being. The actuating cause of our personhood. Perhaps Dr. Stevenson is correct in his insistence that the scientific community is indeed ready for an overhaul to broaden the perspective of what constitutes the human being, other than being a meat sack controlled by the electrical impulses of a finite brain. There have been countless claims of individuals whom claim that the life that they are living is not their own. There have been countless claims of individuals who claim that the life they are living is not their own. It is, to put it into parlance, not their first rodeo. Makes a great plot for a movie or book. Is there any substance to the beliefs of literally billions of people whom steadfastly believe in reincarnation? Can it lead to a life of reckless abandon? To quote James Dean, live fast, die young, leave a good-looking corpse? Or can
it That's funny.
Or can it lead to living a more thoughtful and caring life? Because the opposite would doom you to relive the same life over and over in an endless cycle of live, die, repeat. The majority of the scientific community believe that our existence is finite, despite many religions believing that our existence is infinite, moving from body to body, enriching our souls with each successive life. A slow-growing number of academics seem to be at odds, using scientific protocols to prove supernatural existence. Ian Stevenson died in 2007. Just before his passing, he donated to the Division of Perceptual Studies a small combination lock which he set the combination to. He told no one the combination, stating simply that he would open it when he came back. And if that ain't a kick in the sack, I don't know what is.
All right, everyone. Be sure to go to our Facebook page, Two Nuts in the Sack, and give us a like. We post all our YouTube videos, funny memes. It's a good site. And please go to our YouTube channel, Two Nuts in the Sack, no spaces, and like, subscribe, comment. Let us know what you want to hear. We love doing this.
Exactly. If we don't hear from you, then you just get to hear what we want to talk about. It gets weirder and weirder. So
this is true.
Give us a shout, give us a like, subscribe, youtube.com.
And seriously, let us know what you want to hear, because we literally, anytime anyone has suggested what they want to hear, we do a podcast on it. If you tell us what you want, we'll do it.
Yeah, the Reincarnation was one of your suggestions.
And another fan suggested the Old Hag, so
we do it. You want it. You want it.
I know, I'm like, that's a song.
Tuna.
That's terrible. Oh my god, what's wrong with you?
It was a thing in the 90s. It was, you want it. You got it.
It's kind of pitchy.
Toyota.
It's kind of pitchy. Listen, man, it's kind of pitchy.
You're fucking up my ad.
Your ad is terrible. Just stop.
It worked well for Toyota in the 90s.
No, it's just terrible. Please stop.
I'm going to cut most of this shit out if you don't mind.
I don't know. I think this was kind of funny.
It was kind of funny.
I think you should leave it.
Alright, well, I'm the one that does the editing, and we just hit the 2-hour mark.
Good night.
Good night, or good day, or wherever you happen to listen to our podcast. But do remember to subscribe. YouTube, Two Nuts in the Sack, no spaces, otherwise you get some really weird shit.